There he was, standing in front of a glass case, looking at a dress his mother had worn more than 70 years ago. Not speaking. Not moving much. Just looking. And somehow, that said everything. This was not a king opening an exhibition. This was a son standing in the middle of his mother's life, one piece at a time. That is the image people cannot stop talking about. King Charles III walked into the King's Gallery at Buckingham Palace for an exhibition called Queen Elizabeth II, Her Life and Style. On paper, it sounds elegant, formal, even predictable. A royal event. A gallery visit. A few photographs. Some polite remarks. That is what many people would expect. But that is not what really happened. Let's talk about what really happened. This was not just about fashion. It was not even mainly about fashion. It was about memory. It was about grief. It was about history sitting still behind glass while the man who had lived beside it all his life tried to take it in. And the thing is, the exhibition was built in a way that made that almost impossible to do without emotion. More than 300 items were on display. Think about that for a second. 300 pieces from Queen Elizabeth II's life. Clothes from childhood. Clothes from wartime. Dresses worn in moments the whole world remembers. Pieces from the years when she was a young princess, then a bride, then a queen, then a symbol known everywhere. Not copies. Not costumes. The real things. The actual fabrics. The real stitching. The garments that had once touched her skin, moved with her body, and stood with her in some of the most important moments of the last century. That is why the title mattered so much. Not her wardrobe. Not royal fashion. But her life and style. The exhibition was telling her story through clothing, and suddenly those clothes were not just clothes anymore. They were evidence. Evidence of who she had been. Evidence of what she carried. Evidence of how carefully she lived. People close to the exhibition said the mood changed the moment Charles arrived. He was there with Queen Camilla, but even in a room full of staff, curators, and royal officials, there was a sense that this was deeply personal. Witnesses described him as thoughtful, quiet, and intensely focused. Not the kind of focus people put on for cameras. Real focus. The kind that happens when you are seeing something familiar in a completely new way. Because that was the strange part. He had seen these clothes before. Of course he had. He had seen them on his mother at weddings, ceremonies, public visits, church services, and state occasions. He had seen them in family life and national life. He had seen them as part of the living woman. But now the woman was gone. And the clothes were still here. That changes everything. It is one thing to remember your mother in a photograph. It is another thing to stand in front of something she once wore and realize how much of a life can remain inside fabric. That is what many people don't know about moments like this. They look formal from the outside, but inside them, there is often a private earthquake happening. And then came the piece that seemed to hit him the hardest. The wartime overalls. The plain, practical overalls worn by the young Princess Elizabeth during World War II, when she joined the Auxiliary Territorial Service in 1945. Before she was queen. Before the crown. Before 70 years of duty. She trained as a driver and mechanic. She worked. She served. She wore clothes that were made for labor, not ceremony. When Charles saw them, he reportedly said something simple. You never throw anything away. Now that sentence sounds small if you read it quickly. But it was not small. It carried so much. It sounded like surprise, yes. But also admiration. And maybe even a little disbelief at the way his mother and grandmother had preserved the past so carefully. Because those overalls were not saved by accident. They had survived because someone understood, long before anyone else did, that they would matter one day. A young princess's work clothes had become a national treasure. That is the kind of detail that stays with people. And it tells you what kind of story this really is. Not a glossy royal fashion story. Not a simple museum piece. This is a story about how a woman lived so carefully, so steadily, and with such a strong sense of duty that even the clothes she repeated, repaired, and quietly stored away became part of history. There was also something almost painful in the contrast. In one room, the wartime overalls. In another, the grand gowns. In one case, the young woman who rolled up her sleeves. In another, the queen dressed for the whole world to see. And somewhere between those two images stood her son, now king himself, trying to take in both at once. People often think royal life is all sparkle and ceremony. But these stories provide insight into something else. They show how much of monarchy is built through objects, rituals, and memory. A coat is never just a coat. A gown is never just a gown. A fabric choice can carry duty, politics, restraint, even comfort. And Charles knew that better than anyone. He knew what it cost for her to put those clothes on day after day. He knew what the world expected when she stepped outside. He knew how she used clothing not for vanity, but for presence. To be seen. To reassure. To show continuity. That is why this visit landed so hard. Because in those rooms, all of that came back at once. The little details. The public role. The private mother. The woman before the crown. The woman inside it. And the truth is, this was only the beginning. Because once you step past the first emotional shock of the exhibition, something bigger starts to appear. You begin to see that this was not only a look back at Queen Elizabeth II. It was also, quietly, a story about the man standing there now. About what he inherited. About what shaped him. And about the thread running from mother to son. To understand why this exhibition hit so hard, you have to go back long before Charles became king. Long before Queen Elizabeth II became the figure the world knew. Long before the polished image, the bright coats, the hats, the balcony waves, the endless public appearances. Because before all of that, she was a girl being raised inside a system that believed deeply in duty, discipline, and preservation. And what many people don't know is that this habit of keeping things carefully did not begin with Elizabeth alone. It went back to her mother, the Queen Mother, who seems to have understood very early that these clothes were more than personal belongings. They were records. They were pieces of a life that history would one day want to study. So things were saved. Carefully. Thoughtfully. Almost reverently. A christening robe from royal tradition. Tiny dresses from childhood. Uniform pieces from wartime. Wedding garments. State gowns. Evening dresses. Coats, hats, sketches, accessories. Over the years, this was not treated like a closet being cleared out. It was treated like a living archive. That matters. Because most people do not live like that. Most of us wear something, remember it for a while, and then it fades into the blur of life. But in royal life, clothes often mark events. A public appearance becomes part of national memory. A dress becomes tied to a day. A coat becomes tied to a visit. A gown becomes tied to a promise. Elizabeth seemed to understand this better than almost anyone. She also understood something else. Repetition was not weakness. That is important, because today a lot of public life runs on constant novelty. New look. New outfit. New image. New headline. But Queen Elizabeth II was different. She wore things again. She restyled them. She updated them. She respected the craft behind them enough not to treat them as disposable. She did not wear clothes to chase attention. She wore them to do a job. That may sound simple, but it shaped her entire public image. If she chose bright colors, it was often so people in the crowd could spot her. If a hemline changed, it was done with care. If a coat came back years later, it was because waste was not the point. Service was. Practicality was. Continuity was. And Charles grew up inside that world. He watched it from the inside, not as a historian but as a son. He saw the planning. He saw the importance of appearances. He saw how clothing became part of public duty. He saw that for his mother, getting dressed was never only private. It was part of being queen. There is a line in this whole story that stays with you. For the people lining the streets, even a simple Tuesday visit was not simple at all. It was the day they saw the queen. That explains so much. Because once you understand that, you understand why she dressed the way she did, why so much was saved, and why this exhibition feels less like a style show and more like a map of service. Then there are the big landmark pieces, the ones that carry almost too much symbolism to hold. The wedding dress, for example. Norman Hartnell designed it for her marriage to Prince Philip on November 20th, 1947. Britain was still weary from war. Rationing was part of life. People were tired. The country needed beauty, hope, and a reason to smile. And that dress became part of that feeling. 10,000 seed pearls. Months of work. A design inspired by Botticelli's Primavera. But what made it unforgettable was not just the beauty. It was the timing. The mood. The sense that the country was looking at a young bride and seeing the possibility of better days. And then, a few years later, the coronation gown. Again Hartnell. Again extraordinary detail. Only this time the meaning was even heavier. The dress carried emblems from the nations and Commonwealth realms she would serve. The English rose. The Scottish thistle. The Welsh leek. The Irish shamrock. Symbols sewn into a gown for the moment she accepted a burden she would carry for 70 years. That is not normal fashion. That is statecraft in silk. That is messaging through embroidery. That is monarchy turned into fabric. And then, just when you think the story is all grandeur, something else appears. The poodle skirt. Yes, really. A playful gift from an American designer, given to Princess Elizabeth. It now sits in the same broader story as coronation's silk and wartime uniform. And that matters because it breaks the stiffness. It reminds you that she was not only a symbol. She could laugh. She could receive something fun. She had a lighter side. The exhibition does something very clever there. It lets the queen come down from the pedestal without lowering her importance. That is hard to do. But it works. Because the full picture of a life is never made only of grand moments. It is also made of odd gifts, soft details, repeated habits, practical choices, and small things people nearly forget. That is where the pattern starts to emerge. This was a woman who respected craft. A woman who believed beautiful things should be cared for. A woman who understood clothing as communication. A woman who did not separate image from duty because, in her world, the two were tied together. And Charles, over time, seems to have absorbed much of that. His own interest in traditional crafts, British making, sustainability, and preservation did not come from nowhere. It grew in the same soil. That is why the exhibition was not only about her past. It was also a mirror showing him where some of his deepest values came from. Still, none of that fully prepares you for the emotional side. Because background is one thing. Memory is another. You can know the dates, the designers, the significance, the symbolism. But then you stand in front of the actual garment. And suddenly knowledge is not enough. Then came the moment when all of that history stopped being abstract and became personal all over again. On this particular occasion, the most powerful moments were not loud. They were quiet. That is what made them land so hard. People often expect royal emotion to arrive in big, dramatic form. A tear. A speech. A visible breakdown. But that was not the mood here. The mood was slower. Heavier. More controlled. And somehow that made it even more intense. As King Charles moved through the exhibition, he slowed down. That was one of the details repeated by those who were there. He was not drifting past things politely. He was really looking. Taking time. Letting the objects speak. And then the gallery began to change shape around him. Not literally, of course. But emotionally. Because the later sections of the exhibition moved closer to the years he knew best. The years when he was an adult. The years when he had children of his own. The years when he watched his mother continue to work, continue to appear, continue to carry the role no matter what was happening in private life. That is when the visit seems to have deepened. A staff member described him as looking at the textiles and fabrics with a very particular attention. Not just the attention of someone with taste. Not even the attention of a collector. It was the attention of someone reading a language he had known since childhood. That is such a striking image. Because it suggests that what he was seeing was not only cloth. He was seeing habits. Signals. Choices. Discipline. The steady visual code his mother had lived by for decades. And then there was the conservation work. This is one of those details that sounds technical until you realize how emotional it actually is. Many of the garments looked almost impossibly well kept. Pieces from the 1940s and 1950s appeared fresh, delicate, and astonishingly intact. That does not happen on its own. It takes years of expert work, controlled temperature, careful humidity, special storage, and constant attention. Charles reportedly showed real admiration for this. That makes sense. He has spent much of his public life speaking about preservation, of architecture, craftsmanship, the environment, traditional methods and materials. So standing in a room where his mother's clothes had been protected with that level of care must have struck a deep nerve. Because preservation is not only about objects. It is also about love. To preserve something so carefully is to say, this mattered, this still matters, and we are not letting it disappear. That may be the quiet heart of the whole exhibition. And yet, the hardest emotional point may still have been the simplest one, seeing the clothes without seeing her. That is the real crisis inside this story. Not scandal. Not conflict. Absence. The clothes stand there in perfect shape. The embroidery shines. The silk holds. The structure remains. But the person who gave them meaning and motion is gone. So the gallery becomes a place where presence and absence sit side by side. You can feel her everywhere. And nowhere. That is hard enough for the public. Imagine what it felt like for him. Especially in front of the coronation gown. Think about that scene. The dress his mother wore on the day she became Queen Elizabeth II. The day she stepped fully into history. The day the role became permanent. The day duty stopped being preparation and became destiny. And now her son, who had spent his whole life in the shadow of that duty, stood in front of it as king. No wonder people said he lingered. No wonder the room went quiet around him. No wonder the curator reportedly gave him space. Because what do you even say in a moment like that? This was not simply admiration for fine design. This was a man looking at the beginning of the reign that shaped his whole life. People outside royal circles often talk about the crown as power. And yes, of course it is power. But exhibitions like this remind you that it is also inheritance, pressure, training, sacrifice, and repetition. 1,000 repeated acts of being seen. 1,000 choices made not for self, but for role. Charles knew that cost. He had watched it up close for decades. That is why one remark from the curator mattered so much. She said he seemed interested in the fabrics, and what they said about British manufacturing, and why that had mattered to the late Queen and matters to him today. There it was. The connection. Mother to son. Old values carried forward in a different reign. Duty, but also craftsmanship. Elegance, but also practicality. Visibility, but also restraint. The exhibition was exposing that thread more clearly than any speech could. And the fallout of that exposure was emotional, not political. It forced everyone watching to see him differently too. Not just as the king opening an exhibition about his mother, but as someone who had inherited not just her position, but parts of her philosophy. That is what many people had missed. They saw the public transition after her death. They saw the ceremonies, the headlines, the constitutional language. But this exhibition offered something softer and more revealing. It showed the private bridge between them. Not in letters. Not in speeches. In clothes. That is what made the visit so intimate. The world usually sees royal fashion as surface. But here, surface became depth. Stitching became memory. Texture became biography. Preservation became grief made visible. And once that truth started to come through, the whole visit changed meaning. It was no longer just a royal engagement. It became a conversation across time. Between a son and a mother. Between one reign and the next. Between the woman who preserved the past and the man now deciding what to carry into the future. But even then, the full truth was still coming into focus. Because the story was never only about emotion. It was also about legacy. And legacy is where things become even more revealing. The full truth of this exhibition is bigger than dresses, bigger than royal memory, and even bigger than grief. It is about values. That is the part that really stays with you. Once you step back and look at the whole collection, a clear picture starts to form. Queen Elizabeth II did not build her public image through random choices. She built it through consistency, through discipline, through respect for craft, through an understanding that clothing in her life was part of service. That is why the archive feels so rich. Not because everything is glamorous. Because everything means something. The wartime overalls tell you she understood service before she wore the crown. The wedding dress tells you she became a symbol of hope in a tired country. The coronation gown tells you she accepted enormous responsibility. The poodle skirt tells you she had warmth and humor too. The repeated outfits and altered garments tell you she believed in using things well, not simply replacing them. Put all that together, and the picture becomes hard to miss. Her wardrobe was not built for vanity. It was built for duty, memory, and message. And that is where Charles comes back into the story in such a strong way. Because this exhibition also quietly explains him. His long interest in sustainability, repair, local craft, and thoughtful consumption is not some modern branding exercise that came out of nowhere. You can see roots of it here. In the way his mother lived. In the way things were kept. In the way quality mattered. In the way old things were not discarded simply because time had passed. That makes the exhibition feel strangely current, too. Today people talk all the time about waste, fashion cycles, overconsumption, and what it means to buy better and keep longer. And here is this archive showing that the late Queen had been living by a version of that logic for decades. Not as a trend. Not as a campaign. Simply as a way of being. That is powerful. Especially because it was not shouted. It was lived. And the public reaction to all of this makes perfect sense. People are drawn to stories where the grand and the human meet. That is exactly what happened here. An exhibition with royal glamour on the surface revealed something much more personal underneath. A son trying to read his mother's life through the things she left behind. That image connects with people far beyond monarchy. Because almost everyone knows some version of it. A coat still hanging in a closet. A pair of glasses left in a drawer. A handbag, a recipe card, a favorite chair, a jacket that still seems to hold a person's shape. Objects can hit with shocking force after someone is gone. Now imagine that on the scale of history. Imagine rooms full of carefully preserved objects from one of the most recognized women on earth, and then imagine her son walking through them after her death. Of course people responded. Of course it moved them. Of course it made headlines. But the deeper effect is quieter than headlines. It makes people think about what we keep. What we throw away. What we pass on. What our objects say about us after we are gone. That is why the exhibition matters even to people who are not especially interested in royal fashion. It becomes a story about how lives are remembered. Not only through speeches or portraits, but through touchable things that outlast the moment. There is also something deeply revealing in the way the designers were honored. Norman Hartnell's sketches shown beside finished gowns. The craftsmanship made visible. The process exposed, not hidden. It reminds people that these iconic looks did not appear by magic. They were made by skilled hands, careful eyes, and long hours of work. That matters too. Because one truth running through this whole story is that beauty, when done seriously, is labor. And labor deserves respect. The same is true of the conservation teams who kept the garments in such remarkable condition. Their work is almost invisible when it is done well, but it sits under everything. Without them, this emotional encounter could not have happened in the same way. Without them, the clothes would have faded, weakened, or disappeared into time. Instead, they remained, waiting. And then Charles came, and the waiting turned into witness. That may be the most moving part of all. These garments were preserved for history, yes. For the public, yes. For scholarship, yes. But in that moment, they also became part of one man's private reckoning with the life of his mother. Not a dramatic reckoning. A quiet one. A slow one. A real one. For a little while, he was not only the king. He was a son standing among the physical remains of his mother's duty. That is the truth at the center of everything. And it leaves us with a bigger thought. Power often looks huge from the outside. Ceremonies, crowns, palaces, guards, headlines. But when you get close enough, power is still carried by human beings. Human beings who age, repeat habits, save old things, honor craft, miss their parents, and leave behind objects that begin to speak when they no longer can. That is why this story lingers. Because in the end, the exhibition does not just show what Queen Elizabeth II wore. It shows how she lived. Carefully. Steadily. With intention. And it shows what her son now carries forward, whether he says it out loud or not. The old overalls. The tiny christening robe. The wedding silk. The coronation embroidery. The playful skirt. The repeated coats. The preserved sketches. The carefully stored fabric. All of it says the same thing in different ways. That duty leaves traces. That love can look like preservation. That memory can live in cloth. And that sometimes the simplest sentence holds the most truth of all. You never throw anything away when it matters this much.